There is a kind of determination that doesn't ask permission. It rises before the rooster, patches what it can with what's left, and faces the open sky without flinching. Not because it isn't afraid, but because fear is a luxury it cannot afford. Denton Briggs had seen that kind of determination exactly twice in his life. Once in his father, who had built a cattle operation in eastern Montana from nothing but a borrowed mule and a refusal to accept arithmetic. And once on an October morning in 1881, when he rode the fence line of his northern pasture and found a woman on a ladder, alone, nailing cedar shingles onto a barn roof in the wind. He almost didn't stop. His day had a shape to it: boundary check, north water tank, back before noon, and strangers on ladders were not part of the shape. But something made him pull the reins. Maybe it was the ladder itself, which was missing its second rung and leaning at the particular angle of something that had been made to work through stubbornness rather than engineering. Maybe it was the sound of the hammer, which did not slow when she heard his horse. Most people, alone, hearing an unannounced rider, would pause. She didn't. He waited until she finished the row. She came down the ladder backward, one careful boot at a time, and turned to face him with the hammer still in her hand. Not as a weapon, as the thing she was using when he interrupted her. Lenora Pruitt, 31 years old. Brown eyes that measured a situation before her expression did. She had the kind of face that would have been called pretty in a parlor and wasn't thinking about that at all. "You're on Pruitt land," she said. "I know it," Denton said. He stayed in the saddle. "The survey line runs 12 feet east of that fence post. I've been meaning to send a rider over." "About the post?" "About the post. To grab us access on your south edge. My cattle have been drifting through the gap." She looked at him with the direct attention of someone who had learned that what people said first was rarely what they meant. "They have," she said. "I've pushed 3 back to your side in the last month." He hadn't known that. He showed nothing, but he filed it. Her name was registered on the deed at the Calhoun County Land Office. Pruitt Homestead, granted under the Homestead Act of 1862, proved up in 1870 by her father, Edmund Pruitt, transferred upon his death in the spring of 1879. She had been running it alone since, 2 years of alone, out here where alone meant something different than it did anywhere else. The barn roof told the story in shingles. The north half was recent work, solid and even. The south half was older, some pieces cupped at the edges, a few missing entirely. She had been working section by section, as money allowed, as time allowed. The ladder with the missing rung told the rest. "I'll look at the gap," Denton said, "with your permission." She gave him a long, considered look. "It's on my property. That's why I'm asking." Something moved in her expression, not warmth yet, but the beginning of recalibration. "Go ahead," she said. He found the gap inside of 5 minutes. 3 fence rails down, the post rotted at the base, the ground around it soft from a beaver-dammed section of the creek that had backed water into the soil. It wasn't a gap that happened overnight. It had been coming for 2 seasons, and she had known it was coming, and there was simply no one to fix it with. When he returned, she was back on the ladder. "Post is rotted through," he said to her back. "You'll need to dig 2 feet deeper on the replacement. The soil's saturated from the dam upstream." She came down again, slower this time, thinking. "I know about the dam. You planning to pull it?" "I'm planning to finish the roof first." She set the hammer in her belt and looked at him with the patience of someone managing a list that was longer than the day. One thing at a time. He understood that arithmetic. He ran 4,200 head across 180,000 acres, and there were still days when the list was longer than the day. "I'll send a crew for the fence," he said. "The gap is letting my cattle onto your land. That's my problem to fix." She didn't answer immediately. Out here, a man who offered something for free was either generous or working towards something. Experience taught you to wait and find out which. In exchange for what, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Right of way through the South Creek crossing, 3 years, seasonal cattle movement, 8 weeks per year. Fair market rate on the water access, paid quarterly. She looked at him steadily. "That creek is the only reliable water on this property." "I know it. That's why the rate is fair and not convenient." He held her gaze. "You'd have first right of refusal on any expansion of the arrangement, in writing." A silence stretched between them, long enough to be honest. "Why not just buy the parcel?" she said. "You're Denton Briggs. That's men with your operation do." He looked at the barn roof, at the ladder, at the neat row of shingles she had laid before he arrived. "Because you're still laying shingles," he said, "I don't think you're interested in selling." The silence this time was different. "The measuring kind. Draw up the terms," she said. "I'll read them." He sent the crew the following Monday. 4 men, a loaded wagon, new posts and rails, and 2 coils of wire. Lenora was already at the fence line when they arrived, with her own digger and a pair of work gloves that had been mended at the thumb. The foreman, a quiet man named Hess, who had been with Denton's operation for 11 years, watched her lift a post from the wagon bed and carry it to the line without asking. He nodded once with the particular respect that people who know hard work extend to other people who know hard work when no words are needed. She worked the south section with them through the morning. The October ground was hard, and digging to the depth the soil required was slow, grinding work. Her shoulders ached by mid-morning, and she reset her grip and kept going, because the alternative was stopping, and stopping meant looking at how far there was still to go. At noon, Hess offered her coffee from the cruise's tin. She took it. They sat on the tailgate in the wind and didn't talk much, which was its own kind of ease. Denton arrived that afternoon with the written terms. 2 copies, notarized at the county seat in Calhoun. He found Lenora tamping the base of a newly set post with the focused economy of someone who knew what settled ground looked like. She read the document standing in the field, 1 boot propped on the post. She read it twice. On the second reading, her expression shifted. "You added a silt clause," she said. He had. Cattle crossing a shallow creek in volume deposited silt in patterns that could redirect water flow within 2 seasons. A silt management clause protected the creek bank from the kind of slow, invisible damage that looked like nothing until it was too late. "It protects your water source," he said. "I didn't ask for that." "I know." She looked at him with the same directness she had used on the ladder, when she'd turned and found him there and hadn't pretended not to know what she thought. "Why?" she said. "Because the creek is worth more to you intact than to me convenient." He said it plainly. "And because a deal that works for one side for a season isn't worth the paper it's written on." She read the clause a 3rd time, then she signed. Hess told her 3 days later what Denton had said before the crew left the ranch. She hadn't asked. Hess offered it the way some people offer things, not to create a debt, but because it seemed like something a person ought to know. He said, "She's been managing that place alone for 2 years. She knows every problem and every quirk of that land better than any of us will. Don't give her instructions. Ask her where she wants the posts." Lenora received that information without comment. She turned it over the way she turned most things, quietly in the hours when the work was repetitive enough to leave the mind free. He hadn't sent a crew to fix her fence, he'd sent them to work alongside. That distinction was not small. The crew finished in 6 days. The fence line ran true and solid. Lenora walked it the evening after they left, checking each post by hand, pressing at the bases, testing the wire tension. It held. Not the way something repaired holds, braced and provisional, but the way something built right holds, with the particular confidence of work done to last. She stood at the corner post in the last of the October light and allowed herself for a moment to feel the weight of the previous 2 years lift slightly. Not off, just slightly. The list was still long, but 1 item on it was finished. She went inside and updated her ledger. Income from water access, pending first payment. Fence line, restored, creek gap, closed. Then she loaded her father's Springfield rifle and set it by the door, because the ledger was also a record of what the county was like, and what the county was like required that certain preparations never be let to lapse. November came with the first hard frost, and with it came Luther Vane. He arrived on a Tuesday riding a sorrel horse with expensive tack that was wrong for the country, the kind of horse and gear that announced money without understanding work. He dismounted in the yard without being invited and looked at the property the way certain men look at things they have already decided to acquire. Luther Vane, land broker out of Miles City. Not a forger and not precisely violent, but the kind of man who had learned to operate in the space between law and consequence with the ease of long practice. In the previous 3 years, he had acquired 14 homestead properties in Calhoun County alone, most of them from widows, drought-broke ranchers, or people in the particular exhaustion of a bad winter who hadn't read what they were signing closely enough. The railroad was coming through. Everyone in the territory knew it. The Northern Pacific survey teams had been in the county since spring, and where survey teams went, speculators followed, buying distressed land cheap and waiting for the depot announcements that would multiply the value overnight. Vane had been ahead of that curve for 2 years, and he was very good at identifying properties worth acquiring before their owners understood why they were worth acquiring. He knew about the creek. "Miss Pruitt," he said, tipping his hat with the particular charm of a man who had practiced it until it looked natural. "I've been authorized to make you a serious offer on this property. $900, clean sale, quick close." Lenora leaned against the porch post with her arms folded. "The property is under a water rights and pasture access agreement. Signed and notarized. Leaseholder is Denton Briggs." The smile didn't disappear. It adjusted, recalibrated into something slower and flatter. "Leases are paper, Miss Pruitt. Briggs has his own operation to worry about, and this county," he let the sentence rest for a moment, easy and unhurried, "is a long ride from the nearest federal land office." He let the silence sit. It was a practiced silence, the kind that was meant to feel like wait. "I'll be back Thursday," he said. "I'd encourage you to have a different answer ready." He rode out. Lenora watched him until the sorrel cleared the tree line. Then she went inside and wrote in her ledger. Vane Luther, Miles City Broker, Nov. 8. Offer made, $900. Threat, implicit, regarding lease enforceability and county isolation, Thursday. She sent a rider to Briggs that same hour. Denton arrived Wednesday evening with 2 of his ranch hands, quietly and without announcement, the way a person who has dealt with serious situations before deals with them before they escalate, not after. He found Lenora at the kitchen table with the Springfield across her knees and the ledger open to the entry. He sat across from her without ceremony and looked at the rifle and then at her. She returned the look with the steadiness of someone who had already thought through every part of what came next and was not afraid of any of it. "He'll bring men," she said. "Probably 2. The kind whose last job you don't ask about. I'm not staying in the house. I didn't come here to ask you to." He looked at her directly. "I came because this creek is in my lease agreement, and what happens to this property is my legal business. I plan to be standing at that fence line Thursday morning, as do I." A pause. The lamp burned even and steady between them. "You know how to use it," he said, nodding toward the Springfield. "My father taught me before the fever took him." She set the rifle on the table. He said, "Property that can't be defended isn't property. It's just land you're borrowing until someone stronger shows up." Denton was quiet for a moment. He wasn't wrong. Thursday came gray and cold, the kind of cold that had edges to it. Vane arrived at mid-morning with 2 riders, exactly as Denton had predicted. Men whose coats were clean and whose eyes were doing the kind of work that suggested the coats were meant to deceive. Vane pulled up at the south fence line and found Denton standing there with his 2 hands. Lenora stood 6 feet to Denton's left with the Springfield on her shoulder and her eyes level and unhurried. Vane took the scene in without changing his expression. He looked at Denton. "Briggs, didn't expect you personally." "I check my water rights personally," Denton said. "This creek runs through a property under my lease agreement. What happens here is my legal concern." Vane's gaze moved to Lenora, to the rifle, to Denton's 2 hands who had the particular stillness of men who were not performing readiness but simply were ready. He looked back at Lenora. "The offer stands at $900 through the end of the month." "The offer was declined Monday," Lenora said. Her voice carried across the cold field without effort. "It was declined when you rode into my yard with a veiled threat. It's declined now. This land is not for sale. The next time you come onto it without an invitation, I'll have the county sheriff and a land attorney from Billings here to meet you." A long silence. One of Vane's riders shifted his horse. The other was looking at a fixed point somewhere past the fence wire. Vane looked at Denton one final time, the measuring kind of look. He found nothing to work with. He touched the brim of his hat, turned the sorrel, and rode. Nobody said anything until the sound of hooves faded into the cold. Then one of Denton's hands, a lean man named Orville, who had been with the outfit since the Yellowstone days, said quietly, "First time I've seen Vane ride away from a signed approach empty." Denton glanced at Lenora. She was already walking back to the house. Word traveled in Calhoun County the way it always traveled in cattle country. Not through newspapers, but through the particular network of people who spent enough time in the open to notice what happened in it. By the following week, 4 neighboring homesteaders had ridden to the Pruitt place specifically to hear the account from Lenora directly. A land broker turning away from a confrontation he had arrived to win was not the kind of thing that happened without reason, and people who lived close to the land paid close attention to reasons. 2 weeks later, Denton was registering a deed adjustment at the county seat in Calhoun when the land recorder, a deliberate man named George Sutter who had been in that office since the territorial days, stopped him on the way out. "I heard Vane left the Pruitt place without the paperwork," George said. "He did." George looked at him over the rim of his spectacles. "You know what you did, putting your name on a lease agreement with a woman running a broke homestead on a failing fence. I know what I did. Every speculator between here and Billings is going to think twice before approaching a property with your signature on the water rights." He said it without particular inflection, as simple observation. That's not a small thing in this territory right now. That was the intention. George was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the deed log on his desk. "In 26 years of recording land transactions in this county," he said, "I don't think I've once seen a man with your operation walk away from an acquisition because the seller said no." He looked up. "That's uncommon." "She wasn't selling," Denton said. "That's not a complicated thing." George shook his head slowly. "Apparently it is, for most men." Denton rode back to the Pruitt place that afternoon and relayed what George had said. Lenora listened to the porch with her coffee, looking out at the fence line. "He's right," she said finally. "That is not how this usually goes." She looked at him. "Thank you, Denton." It was the first time she had used his given name. He registered it and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. December set in hard and early. The creek froze from the edges inward, gray plates spreading toward the dark current at the center. Denton's cattle crossed twice weekly on the schedule agreed in the lease. Lenora monitored the crossings as the agreement required, water levels, ice thickness, bank compression, and sent written reports to the Briggs operation at Cedar Bend every Friday. He replied with brief, accurate notes. Corrections sometimes, but more often additions. Context that expanded what she was already tracking, the knowledge of someone who had watched this particular kind of country through a lot of seasons. It was a correspondence of practical information that was, without either of them stating it directly, something else as well. He came in person on the 3rd Thursday of the month, nominally to assess the crossing before the heaviest cattle movement of the season. He found Lenora crouching at the bank, examining a section of soil that had compressed under the approach traffic. "You need a brush and stone deflector here," she said without looking up, and again 15 yards upstream, slows the cattle on approach, distributes the load across a wider surface. She pressed the soil at the edge with 2 fingers and showed him the compression depth. "Without it, this bank loses another 4 inches this season." He crouched beside her. She was correct. The technique was standard knowledge among experienced creek managers, but it lived in observation and practice rather than books, and the fact that she had arrived at it independently told him something he had already suspected. They stood. The cold was direct and honest, the kind that clarifies rather than confuses. "These reports," Denton said. "In 10 years, anyone working this land will know exactly how this creek behaves through every season. That knowledge usually disappears when the person who holds it does." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about who works this land in 10 years. "I have been," he said. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. The creek ran dark and quiet beneath the ice at its edges. "Miss Pruitt," he said in a register that was careful and deliberate, not the register of negotiation, but not far from it, "I'd like to discuss whether the arrangement between us might take a different form. Something more permanent." She held his gaze. "You're talking about more than the creek access." "I am." She did not answer then. She had not built what she had built by answering things that deserved consideration with anything less. She answered 4 days later. Sunday morning, frost on the grass, no ceremony. She rode to Cedar Bend, tied her horse at the gate, and walked to where he was repairing a tank fitting on the north pasture. He saw her coming across the frozen ground and stopped working and waited. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved through his expression, something steady and warm. The Pruitt homestead stays registered as a separate title. 160 acres, my name, my deed. That doesn't change, agreed. I manage the creek records and the South Range ledger. That system is mine, and it stays intact. I'd expect nothing less. She looked at him with the even directness she had used since the first morning on the ladder. And I'm not a decoration. If I'm part of this operation, I'm part of it in the way that counts. He met her gaze steadily. I told Hess before the fence crew came that you'd know that land better than any of them. I told him to ask, not instruct. He paused. I knew what I was looking at in October. The silence between them held the weight of everything that had led to this moment, the ladder, the ledger, the rifle on the table, Vane turning his horse in the cold field, 4 days of letters about creek data that were never only about creek data. Then we're agreed, she said. He extended his hand. She shook it, firm, clean, the same as the first time. Not rescue, not relief. The steady confidence of someone who had read every clause, considered every condition, and found the terms sound. Spring arrived the way it always arrived on the northern plain, without announcement, testing what the winter had left standing. The frost cracked first along the south fence line, ground giving where the new posts had been set deep and true. The creek bank showed none of the erosion that had threatened it in November. The barn roof held through every snowfall and thaw cycle without a single leak. The first page of the spring ledger read, Pruitt Briggs, Calhoun County, Montana Territory, spring 1882. Lenora was turning the garden ground on the east side of the house. First pass of the season, testing what had come through, when she heard a horse in the yard and recognized the sound without looking up. Denton walked to the garden edge. Squash this year, he asked. Squash and dried beans. Rotating off the rye ground from last fall. He nodded. Sound decision. They stood in the early spring light, two people who had arrived at something carefully. Condition by condition, repair by repair, letter by letter. Not out of need, though the need had been real. Not out of rescue, though the threat had been real. Out of the recognition that some things work better together than apart, and that the strongest foundations are built from the same material as the strongest fences. Good posts, right depth, honest wire, and the refusal of either side to leave a gap unclosed. There is a kind of wealth that doesn't arrive on a flashy horse with silver tack. It doesn't show up with a briefcase of offers and a practiced smile. It shows up with a notarized lease and a silt clause that protects the person who didn't think to ask for it. It shows up at a fence line on a cold Thursday morning, not to take something but to stand beside someone. The deed for Pruitt Briggs, Calhoun County, 2 names, 2 signatures, was filed at the county land office that April. George Sutter registered it without comment, but he held it a moment longer than necessary before setting it in the record. 26 years. He had never filed one quite like it. He filed it, and he meant for it to hold.